Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Joint Select Committee on Budget Process Reform will come to order. I want to welcome you to the fifth public hearing of the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform. The most important role given to Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution is the power of the purse. Our panel is charged with ensuring we have a working process in order to fulfill this essential duty. During our hearings so far, we've identified some of the recurring challenges that need addressing. Those have been extremely productive discussions. I was especially pleased to see the level of engagement from and hear the ideas of members during our Members' Day meeting. While we have discussed the annual budget resolution at length during a previous hearing, today we're going to focus on what is supposed to happen next, and that's the consideration of appropriations bills. Especially in a reform-focused committee like ours, we certainly need to be mindful of past processes and let history's successes and their failures guide our decisions. And the fact of the matter is that the current process needs improvement. I think both sides of the aisle agree on that. We on this panel are charged with designing a neutral process for the future, one in which Congress can move forward with its budgetary agenda, no matter which party holds a majority. Budgetary priorities, outcomes, and results should come from elections. Thus, a properly functioning budget and appropriations process should be neutral to specific outcomes. That being said, as we engage in conversation today, I urge members to think about designing a process for the future. I believe we can do that by considering what the modern Congress can handle right now and anticipating the issues future Congresses might need endure. Without question, I have tremendous respect for the decades of experience that will come before us today. But I want to challenge us all to think about how that experience can be applied to what future office holders will face as they try to fund the government on time. To help us think through the current appropriations process, including its link to the annual budget resolution, we are pleased to welcome two incredibly distinguished and experienced witnesses. While both served on the same side of the aisle, their perspectives demonstrate that the issues we're trying to fix transcend party lines. In fact, as I was thinking through the potential witnesses, one name quickly stood out in my mind: Leon Panetta. This is an individual whose seasoned career encompasses many positions that are relevant to our deliberations. He served as a congressional staffer, executive branch official, advisor to the mayor of New York, chairman of the House Budget Committee. His painting hangs in these chambers. White House Chief of Staff, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Director of the CIA, and finally, Secretary of Defense. Given his tremendous background, I knew his presence at this hearing today was vital. Secretary Panetta, it's an honor to have you. Thank you for being here. We're also pleased to welcome David Obey, who served for decades as part of the Wisconsin delegation in Congress. During his tenure, he led as both ranking member and chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. Chairman Obey, as an appropriator, I also appreciate you being here today to give us your valuable insight. And with that, I want to yield to my co-chair, Ms. Lowy, for her brief opening remarks. Ms. Lowy?
Thank you, and welcome to the Joint Select Committee's fifth hearing. Today, we have two witnesses with many, many years of experience with the budget and appropriations process and a wealth of knowledge on that subject. Both are good friends, so I'm looking forward to hearing your direct, honest testimony. One is David Obey, who served in the House for 42 years as a representative from Wisconsin. He was a long-standing member of the House Appropriations Committee, served as chairman or ranking minority member of that committee for almost 2 decades. He has also been involved in many past debates about budget process reform. And our other witness, with whom I also had the privilege of serving, is Leon Panetta, who is another former member of the House, past chairman of the House Budget Committee. In addition, he has extensive experience at very senior levels of the executive branch, including service as director of OMB, White House Chief of Staff, director of the CIA, Secretary of Defense. So today, I am delighted that we'll hear from them about what could be done to make our budget and appropriations processes work better. In addition to talking about procedural changes that might help, I hope we'll get the benefit of their long-term perspective on the polarization and partisanship that is now the fundamental cause of many of our difficulties. I think I'll read that sentence again, because I really feel that's the cause. So I hope we'll get the benefit of their long-term perspective on the polarization and partisanship that is now, in my judgment, the fundamental cause of many of our difficulties. So I look forward to the testimony. I should also mention that unfortunately I'll need to leave partway through this hearing to attend the first House-Senate Conference Committee meeting on 2019 appropriation bills. I wish I could stay for all of what should be a very interesting session. And frankly, just to throw some information into the mix, what's very interesting about this appropriation season is the Senate is operating in a bipartisan way. Every bill they've completed is bipartisan. Where last night we completed labor HHS with about 50 amendments. So we're operating very differently, and that could be an interesting discussion in itself as to process. Thank you, my co-chair.
I thank the distinguished co-chair, the gentlelady from New York. Now I'd like to welcome our distinguished witnesses. First, and as I told him when he came in, I didn't know whether to call him chairman, chief, director, Mr. Secretary, so I think I'll just say Jimmy's daddy is here to be a witness before this committee. So Mr. Secretary Panetta, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you. And for both gentlemen, your official statements are being made as part of the official record of this proceeding, and we're going to give you 10 minutes each to present your testimony at your pleasure. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be here and share my experiences and thoughts with you on the tough task that is confronting to try to implement important budget reforms that can hopefully improve that process. I'm also honored to be here with a dear friend and former colleague of mine, Dave Obey. Dave and I together served on the Budget Committee, but more importantly, in all the other positions I held, I had to deal with David when he was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and always found him to be someone who was fully committed to trying to do the right thing for the country. So I'm honored to have this opportunity. And I think, both of us obviously will give you a sense of the history that we experienced and what made the process work at the time. In the 50 years of public life that I've had, I've seen Washington at its best and I've seen Washington at its worst. The good news is I've seen Washington work. And I've seen Democrats and Republicans with a willingness to work together on issues. We've always had our political differences. My first experience in Washington, I was a legislative assistant to Tom Kuechel, who was a Republican from California, the minority whip, served under Everett Dirksen. And at the time, there were a lot of Republicans, both conservative and progressive, but they viewed their responsibility in the Senate as working with Democrats. People like Jackson and Magnuson and Dick Russell, Sam Ervin, and a number of others, Fulbright. They worked together on fundamental issues. When I got elected to the Congress, Tip O'Neill was the Speaker, a Democrat's Democrat, but he worked very closely with Bob Michel, who was the Minority Leader. That was the legacy that I came into as a freshman member, which was that you work with your ranking members, you work with the other party on the legislation that you have to deal with. And so one of the fundamental messages that I have to stress is the importance of bipartisanship to making this process work. This is a tough process. Budget process is tough. Getting the appropriations bills done is tough. And it is difficult to do even when you're working together. It's almost impossible to do when you try to shove this stuff through the process on your own as one party. The history of the budget process in the period when it worked is the history of bipartisanship. The Budget Act was passed on a bipartisan basis. David and I worked with chairman of the Budget Committee who worked with their ranking members, Bob Gimo, Del Latta on the Senate side, Pete Domenici, Muskie, a number of others worked together. When I was chairman of the Budget Committee, I had the honor of working with Bill Gradison and then with Bill Frenzel. And we worked together. And the result was that we made some significant progress. It was not easy. It was a tough time. Deficits were going up for a lot of reasons. But there were three important steps that were taken that I think ultimately led to a balanced budget. One was the 90 budget agreement, in which we assembled both Republicans and Democrats and representatives of the administration to negotiate an approach to deficit reduction. And we met, we negotiated, we finally went out to Andrews Air Force Base and spent close to 3 or 4 weeks negotiating out there. The agreement at the time was that if the Democrats would come forward with $250 billion in spending savings, that the Republicans would be willing to put $250 billion in tax increases on the table. And so we spent a lot of time. It was tough. None of these decisions are easy. But we put together a $500 billion deficit reduction package, close to $500 billion deficit reduction package, and we had to push it through. It was not easy, but we ultimately pushed it through in a bipartisan vote, an omnibus package. It included budget resolution, it included reconciliation, and it included appropriations bills. But it was passed, and we did it on a bipartisan basis. The next effort that I think was important, it was O&B director and worked for Bill Clinton in putting that budget together. And again, $500 billion in deficit reduction. Unfortunately, that wasn't done on a bipartisan basis, and it was tough. It only passed by one vote in the House and in the Senate. And then lastly, the bipartisan effort to put together a balanced budget in '97. All of that contributed to a balanced budget and a surplus. And then it was the breakdown, I think, in bipartisanship that ultimately turned that all around. The process is broken. It's broken because, obviously, bipartisanship is broken down. A regular order has broken down. There's a lack of enforcement. There's a lack of the ability to work together and to all have to wait for crisis in order to drive the process. I often say democracy is a process that we do through leadership or crisis. The problem in this place is that crisis becomes the driver now more than leadership. And when you operate by crisis, you have to wait for something terrible to happen in order to do the right thing. And what you usually wind up doing is kicking the can down the road. And lastly, there's been the misuse of the reconciliation process and the misuse, I think, of the general budget process, which has lost a lot of respect. What are the recommendations to try to fix it? I lay it out in the testimony. I think the idea of a biennial budget is worth looking at. It's not easy. There are problems that you have to work through. But I think the more you can provide additional time to do it and additional time for oversight on ongoing programs, I think that is something to seriously consider. I think a joint budget resolution may make sense as well to bring the president into the process. The way this game works is the president presents his budget, and then Congress decides to go its own way. There's little communication until you do the appropriations part of it. You really ought to engage in the overall budget discussion with the president early on, so that's worth thinking about. I think you ought to change to a calendar basis just to give yourself more time instead of the fiscal year approach. It's not a cure-all, but at least the additional time would help you. I think you have to show a price to be paid for failure to pass a budget resolution, so that legislation that has a fiscal impact, frankly, should not move unless you've passed a budget. You need to provide a process to increase the debt ceiling so we don't have this crisis. We had the Gephardt rule, which tied to the budget resolution. I think that's worth looking at. Budget gimmicks, you have to get rid of budget gimmicks. The whole idea of rosy scenarios and magic asterisks, the kind of games that are played, and I've been a part of some of that. I know what those games are. You've got to be able to discipline people so they don't use it. PAYGO is a very important enforcement tool. We would not have balanced the budget without PAYGO, in which we said if you're going to come up with spending, if you're going to come up with tax cuts, you've got to pay for it and not increase the deficit. You got to get back to that. You should do a common baseline between CBO and OMB. Instead of fighting over growth numbers, frankly, you ought to operate on the same consensus numbers from both of them. I think you need some control of emergency funding that's got out of hand. You need to set up an emergency fund and better controls over how that operates. And I'll tell you, even from the OCO perspective on defense, the fact is, when you've been in war for a long period of time, I don't see why you have to keep going to OCO. It ought to be part of the budget, frankly, for the defense budget. Lastly, some check on mandatory spending. 2/3 of the budget is mandatory spending. We don't pay enough attention to mandatory programs. And then a 10-year budget projection. I think the most important guidance I can give you is that the best way to pass budget reforms is to do a budget deal and to do a comprehensive budget deal. If you can put those pieces together, then you can pass the reforms as part of that. We did that in the 90 budget agreement. If you can't do that, and that's probably the case, then this joint committee ought to try on a bipartisan basis then to make recommendations with regards to some key changes. You don't have to do it all, but at least do a few changes to show that this place can operate on a bipartisan basis when it comes to the budget. This is not a game. This is about the fiscal health of this nation. We are facing a fiscal crisis. 78% of GDP is now debt. We're looking at it going to 152% of GDP, according to CBO. That is trouble for our economy. It's trouble for resources. It's trouble for the American people and for all of the things we care about. So that's what's at stake here. I know that this committee is given the responsibility to do reforms. I think you have the leadership capability to try to move something that sends a signal to the American people that this place can operate the way it should, with Republicans and Democrats agreeing on tough decisions to be able to govern. That's what democracy should be all about. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Obey.
First, let me apologize for my voice this morning. If some of you can't hear what I'm saying, don't worry about it. You're not going to miss a hell of a lot. I'm happy to be here.
Let's make sure that microphone is on.
That's a little better. Okay,
That helps a
thank
little
you.
bit, yes.
Leon is a good friend. He is truly a great American. All you have to do is read his resume to understand that. And if you know him, you know even more so that that's true. We've gone through many battles together, but one difference that separates the two of us is that I'm from the Precambrian era, and Leon is not. He was elected in 1976 after the Budget Act of '74 was in place, so that's the only process he's ever known. I was elected in 1969 before there was a budget committee. In that time, the appropriations process worked reasonably well. We just didn't realize it at the time. At that time, the president's budget meant something. There was no talk about it being dead on arrival. The way it worked was fairly simple. The President sent down the budget, the Appropriations Committee held its hearings and produced its bills. The Ways and Means Committee was on a separate track and took whatever actions they thought was appropriate. There was no formal arithmetic discipline. Discipline came from the recognition by the committee and by party leaders that if the year's work was irresponsible, there would be a price to be paid in public opinion and at the ballot box. Under that system from 1960 through 1974, and please remember this, from 1960 through 1974, deficits averaged a little less than 1% of GDP. In the worst year, the deficit was 2.8%. By comparison, in the years after the Budget Reform Act, from 1974 through 2010, the year I retired, deficits averaged 2.9% of GDP, 3 times as high, and in one year it hit 9.8%. From 1974 on, Congress has searched for a magical provision to rein in the deficit, a process provision. Ever since, the budget process has been as chaotic as it has been super complicated. Why? Much of the blame has been dumped by some on the Appropriations Committee. That's the wrong target. The main procedural problem is that the committee with the responsibility to pass the bills that actually determine specific spending decisions has nothing to do with the budget blueprint under which they're required to operate. When you get right down to it, the main job of the Budget Committee is to agree on 3 macroeconomic numbers: total spending, total revenues, and the level of the deficit. In contrast, the committee that has the responsibility to broker the thousands of program compromises necessary to implement that budget is the Appropriations Committee. So the Budget Committee can fly at 30,000 feet, but the Appropriations Committee and the Ways and Means Committee have to slug it out on the ground level in hand-to-hand combat. That means that if the Budget Committee targets are too optimistic, ideological, or unrealistic, the Appropriations Committee cannot get the votes on the floor to implement their product. When I retired in 2010, I was succeeded by Hal Rogers as Appropriations Chairman. I watched what happened to him. Each year, the Budget Committee would push a highly aggressive budget resolution through the House, but when Hal tried to implement that resolution with actual program-by-program cuts, members who had voted for the budget resolution would see what the resolution in macro terms actually required in micro program terms, and members who had voted for the resolution initially would then say, "What? You want me to cut what? Are you crazy? Hell no." And the system stalls. So what would I do to change things? That depends on whether you want to do major surgery or a patch job. For instance, 2-year appropriations is a wonderful idea if you want to erode congressional power, weaken Congress's ability to deal with the bureaucracy, and bury the Congress in supplementals. Outside of that, it's a terrific idea. If you want to do fundamental change, I would do 4 things. 1 is procedural. I would abolish the Budget Committee and return to the practice of using old-fashioned informal political sanctions to impose fiscal responsibility. That would give you more time to focus on the bills that actually spend the money. The Budget Act simply adds 1 more hurdle that Congress must overcome without adding 3 months more to the calendar. All the budget resolution really is an institutional press release if it's not followed up by something else. People will say, "Oh my God, you can't do that," or the deficit will balloon again. I would simply say that the numbers I previously cited demonstrate that the empirical evidence for that view is non-existent. Deficits are larger now as a percentage of the economy than they were before the Budget Committee was created to prevent it. Second, recognize what history tells us on revenues. Recognize that in the last 50 years, the budget has never approached balance when revenues as a percentage of GDP have not neared 20%. Third, recognize that we're not just in danger of passing on an uncontrolled budget deficit to our children, we're also in danger of leaving them with an infrastructure deficit, a skilled worker deficit, a science and tech deficit. recognize that over the past 50 years, non-defense appropriation spending has never been less than 3.1% of GDP. The budget resolution passed by the House last year called for shrinking that to 1.7% of GDP by the end of 10 years. I invite you to decide whether that is either achievable or desirable. The fourth thing I would do is recognize that the main problem is not procedural, it's political. My favorite philosopher is Archie the Cockroach, who said once that what matters is not so much what system you have, what matters is what you do with whatever system you happen to have. I would ask you to learn a lesson from 1994 when I chaired Appropriations the first time. I became chairman midway through the session after Bill Natcher died. In spite of that fact, we finished all appropriation bills before the start of the next fiscal year. That didn't happen because I was such a hotshot chairman. It happened because the very first thing I did when I became chairman was to go to my ranking Republican, Joe McDade. I told Joe that I knew we would never agree on the details of appropriations, but I asked him how he would feel about the committee reporting a bipartisan 302B budget allocation. He jumped at the chance. For the first and only time in the history of the Budget Act, that's what we did. It meant that we'd agreed on how much money each appropriation subcommittee would allocate, or would be allocated, but left the details to the subcommittees. Unfortunately, it will be almost impossible to resurrect any degree of bipartisanship because of the way you all are elected. Too many of you come from hugely safe districts. The way your districts are drawn produces little incentive to compromise. That problem is beyond the reach of this committee to correct, but please at least recognize that your basic problem is not the budget process. The budget process is simply one example of how our political system has crippled the legislative system. Meanwhile, if all you really want to do is to put a patch or two on the process, I would recommend one procedural change. Right now, the Budget Committee Chair and Appropriations Committee Chair live in two different political worlds. If you want to make the process more realistic, do one thing. Either make the chairman of the Appropriations and Ways and Means co-chairman of the Budget Committee, or make the Budget Committee Chair rotate between the two. That way, the people who are expected to deliver the goods are the people who are actually manufacturing them.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony. We will move straight into questions, and I'll begin to both of you, but particularly Secretary Panetta. Two things that, in reading between the lines of your testimony, there are two things that come to mind to me. One is the word discipline, having the discipline to do what the process is outlined to produce. And the other one was bipartisanship. And as Mr. Obey has just testified, that's beyond kind of the control of the Joint Select Committee. But is it possible to get to a solution to the challenges that face the modern day Congress without a discipline to deal with the process the way it's been given to you, and without some spirit of bipartisanship, which seems to be very elusive across the spectrum of issues facing the Congress?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as stressed by both of our comments, you can't do one without the other. I mean, that's the problem. I think the reality is that bipartisanship and the ability to work together is the key to implementing discipline. If one party alone tries to implement that discipline and doesn't have support across the aisle, then it's going to be stopped and blocked and basically will be pushed to a point where it doesn't serve the process that that it was designed to implement. Look, there's no question. I mean, your fundamental problem right now is the lack of willingness to enforce what the Budget Act is all about. And admittedly, Budget Act and the budget process has never been an easy one to implement because it does represent discipline. As chairman of the Budget Committee, you're never popular because you are establishing priorities. But the nature of the budget process is to establish priorities. It's not about numbers. This is not about just moving numbers around. It's what are the priorities of this country? That's what's reflected in any budget. And we're not going to achieve any of our priorities if we don't manage our budget because it's going to eat away at our ability to provide the resources necessary. And look, the reality is, David touched on this, but the reality is that the budget you're dealing with is now less than a third discretionary and 2/3 mandatory. There's no way you are going to deal with a $20 trillion debt and not be willing to confront the mandatory issue. Now, I understand the politics of that, and I know how tough it is. But if you're being honest with the American people about the need to deal with the deficit, you're not going to deal with the deficit on the discretionary side alone. That's a joke, especially when you're increasing defense. So if you're serious about doing this, you've got to deal with all of those areas. That requires discipline. It requires a willingness to take risks. Leadership is about taking risks. And if that willingness to do it, if that courage to do the tough decisions is not there, you can frankly implement all the budget reforms you want. Nothing's going to happen in terms of the major problem. So discipline is a key, but you've really got to have bipartisanship and a willingness to work together to make the tough decisions necessary to deal with spending, discretionary, defense, entitlements, and what David talked about, revenues. All of that has to be part of the package. The only successful packages I was a part of in terms of budget agreements included all of those elements. If you want to deal with the budget deficit, you got to deal with all of those elements. But to deal with that, it needs to be bipartisan, and you damn well need to have the cover of the leadership. If the leadership isn't willing to back you up on those kinds of tough decisions, you're not going anywhere.
Mr. Obey, a quick thought?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the father of the Budget Act in the House was Dick Bowling from Missouri, who was my mentor. And I talked to him the night before the Budget Act was scheduled on the floor, because we had a lot of controversy with it. And I remember him saying that unless the leadership of both parties played the numbers straight in the budget process so that people had confidence in the integrity of the process, that you could never expect anybody to support the results. And that is what has happened in my view. You've had all kinds of gimmicks. I mean, my God, when you take a look at the assumptions that were made. I remember one year, good old Ed Muskie, we were in conference. We were $400 million away from reaching the target number we needed on the deficit. And so Muskie wanted to take it out of agriculture. And so in the end, if you took it out of grain, you antagonized the grain farmers. If you took it out of dairy, you antagonized dairy. And so what the committee did was to tell the dairy guys they were going to take it out of grain. They told the grain guys they were going to take it out of dairy. And they passed it by subterfuge. You've got to play straight with the numbers, or you're never going to get anybody to support it. Second thing is your substance has to be seen as fair and just for the people you represent. Otis Pike from New York said this during debate. You will never be held in high regard or deemed ethical while you say you can't balance a budget unless a constitutional amendment makes you. While you accept gloriously optimistic economic projections rather than deal with real ones, while you write a Graham-Rudman bill and then spend days finding ways to get around it, while you let one man make $500 million a year while thousands sleep on the streets. And then the last thing I would note is a statement that Bowling put in the record just prior to the debate on the Budget Act, when he said this: the objective of budget reform should be to make Congress informed about and responsible for its budget actions, not to take away its power to act.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you again for your thoughtful testimony. First of all, for Mr. Obey, 2 weeks ago, we heard testimony from Speaker Ryan in which he endorsed the idea of biennial appropriations, putting funding bills on a 2-year cycle. You said, excuse me, you note that you oppose this proposal, as do I. So number one, could you elaborate on why you think switching to biennial appropriations would be a bad idea? And secondly, for either of you, one of the problems we've been having recently is getting appropriations done because there's a tendency to drag in all sorts of unrelated legislative issues into the appropriations process. It's hard enough just to reaching agreement on funding levels, but when we become the authorizing committee, because the authorizing committees can't do their work, and we try and resolve issues of banking regulation or environmental law or healthcare policy, I just wonder whether all these riders, and I mentioned before that we were in till about 11:30 last night on labor HHS because there were 50 amendments, all kinds of legislative issues. Maybe you can tell me, Chairman Obey, how are these riders handled in the, I'm not even getting into Mr. Panetta's in-depth discussion, but how do you deal with riders in the past? We're becoming the authorizing committee because the authorizing committee can't do their work, and then we get into all kinds of policy arguments and amendments like the 50 last night. Dave, Mr. Obey.
Well, first of all, with respect to your appropriations, I believe that the Congress is not in any position to give away any of its powers. It's given away far too many through the years. And if you take a look at what happens, if you have a 2-year appropriation, understand, once you pass that appropriation bill, the bureaucracy doesn't need you for the rest of that cycle. Under a 1-year appropriation, you've always got something that they want. It's called money. And it makes it tough to get away from the Congress if the Congress is going to have you right back up again next year. It's hard on the Congress to have to go through it twice, but it's the way you preserve your power vis-a-vis the bureaucracy, in my view. Secondly, this idea that somehow if you appropriate 1 year, you'll have all of this time in the second year to do oversight. Bull gravy. The fact is that if you do that, what happens is that you lose the leverage. You lose the leverage that you have with a 1-year budget. Thirdly, supplementals. Congress already does too much by way of supplementals. We funded the longest war in the history of the country on a supplemental. I mean, it's absurd to even think about adding a process that will make it much more likely that Congress will have to wrestle with supplementals. And then the fourth problem is that if you then add to it the inclination of members to grab what must be a must-pass bill and attach their favorite authorizing project to it, and you've got a prescription for chaos. So I would say, first, do no harm. Don't give up the power that the Congress has especially in these days, this democracy requires that you hang on to it.
Well, I thank you very much. Do you have a comment on that, my friend?
Look, just a short comment on it. I think part of the problem is the breakdown in the regular order process that took place. When I was first elected, and David obviously before that, but when I was first elected, the committees meant something. The subcommittees meant something. And look, we had very diverse members in the Congress. On the Democratic side, we had everybody from Sonny Montgomery to Ron Dellums, and a lot of others. And yet, what we did was we operated within the committee process. We had a chance in subcommittee to do hearings, to make amendments, to vote on that legislation. We had a chance on full committee to do hearings and vote on legislation. And the leadership backed up that process. The leadership basically said, we're not going to take up bills unless they go through the regular order process. And you felt as a member that you had a role to play in terms of legislation. It wasn't being done by the leadership, wasn't being done by the Rules Committee, wasn't being done by, a group in a dark office someplace. It was done by you. You were part of the process. That's shut down. And so, yeah, you're going to get a hell of a lot more riders. Why? Because the authorizing committees aren't doing anything. So they're going to basically put the riders on appropriations bills because they know appropriations bills ultimately have to move. So you're going to get a lot more riders with a breakdown in regular order. And look, the process right now, appropriations operates on CRs. I mean, I know the work is done in committees. You try to work through these bills, but ultimately everybody knows that we're going to face a cliff out there, and you're going to wait until you face the cliff to basically have to do anything. And so everybody plays the CR game. And that breaks down the process that David talks about, where the committees are working on this stuff, doing oversight, doing all the things they have to do, because you know what's going to happen. You know the game that's going to be played. You wait till the cliff happens. You wait till you have to raise the debt ceiling to push you. And the leadership's going to get together and try to cut a deal in order to make sure the government doesn't collapse. That's the way you operate now. That's a lousy way to govern.
Just, Mr. Chairman, if I may just
Please.
repeat a couple of facts before, so we don't get too depressed here. 2000, we sometimes have to take the long route to get things done to satisfy everyone's political base. I'm not saying whose, but in 2018, for example, obviously we're dealing now with 2019, we ended up with a really good bipartisan omnibus, a really good appropriation bill. I know because I was on the phone every night. We got rid of 169 riders. You could ask, how did those riders get in the first place? But that's another story. And then that takes us to last night, where we're here with 50 amendments on the House. Senator Shelby is working in a bipartisan way with Senator Leahy. They're bringing bills to the floor. At some place, the charade in the House may be completed, and I have a feeling it's going to end up in a positive bipartisan bill, because it has to. So sometimes you have to go through the machinations because the authorizers aren't doing their work, and they had to bring them into appropriations. And I'm not saying, and I welcome the reason we wanted this hearing, to hear maybe how we could shortcut this. But in the end, after everyone's done their press release and we deal with all the poison pills, we ended up with a pretty good process. And on each of the subcommittees, of which I'm a visitor and a part, there really was some good bipartisan discussions. So it's, I won't throw the whole thing out, But it's an interesting process, the way it is working now, and it's maybe a longer process.
I thank the gentlelady. Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here very much. Mr. Panetta, let me start with you on this. Thanks for the very detailed recommendations that you put in place. I want to continue what Nita was talking about as well on the two-year cycle. You make a pretty strong case for having a two-year budget process. Would you have that same case for a two-year appropriations process, especially with an insight on contracting, CRs, which you mentioned before, lost months when you can actually do contracting? You've been on both sides of this, gives you a unique perspective. So help me understand where you're coming from on a two-year budgeting process, two-year appropriation process.
Well, look, the reality right now is that most of the agreements that are being made are made over a two-year period to try to give you some relief so you don't have to fight the same wars the second year. Look, the biggest problem, and I've seen it from both sides, obviously from the Hill perspective, but also from being in the administration, particularly as Secretary of Defense. The worst problem in terms of defense is uncertainty and not knowing whether, what the numbers are going to be, and not knowing exactly what's going to be available. And, you got weapon systems that are out there that have to be funded. You've got troops that have to be paid. You've got all kinds of requirements that have to be dealt with, and you're not sure what exactly you're going to get. And particularly when sequestration happened, you had this process of then slashing funding across the board. And, at the time I said, it's really going to impact on our ability to do maintenance and all the other things that have to be done. So it is the uncertainty in the process. And I think a two-year process, since it in many ways it's now incorporated in the deal making that goes through it, I think a two-year process that lays it out for 2 years. Look, you can, on the appropriation side, I think Bob Enzi has a good idea of perhaps running 6 bills one year and 6 bills the next, and allowing some degree of oversight in the off year. But the fact that you can lay out some degree of certainty with regards to where you're going so that you can do the planning and you can do the kind of decisions that have to be done, I think that is an important thing to consider in this process.
The connection between reprogramming dollars with appropriations committees and for agencies having to be able to come back for reprogramming authority, is that a sufficient hook to be able to push agency back to appropriators?
Yeah, no, it always is. I think that's right.
Let me ask you, you had an extensive set of paragraphs on budget gimmicks with a full confession that I occasionally used a couple when I was sitting in the other chair. So talk to me about a little bit of how that actually fixes the process. You talked about chimps, you talked about timing shifts, you talked about the magic asterisk.
Yeah.
Are there any of those that are in particular that you say, this is a big issue, or it's just deal with all of them?
I think you got to deal with all of them because, look, the nature of the way you do this process is that it requires difficult decisions, and every time that you have to make cuts, every time you've got to deal with spending programs, it's instead of going directly at it, if you can find a way around it, that's what happens. That's the way we operate. And as I said, I've been part of that. And so, I can remember once as OMB director, I had recommended as OMB director that it was about $8 billion. And I recommended that on the transportation bill, instead of allowing for people to add new projects to the appropriations bills, that they would have to be authorized by the Transportation Committee. Well, there was somebody named Bob Byrd on the Senate side who did not like that because he, was able to pave a lot of West Virginia based on the appropriations bill. And so Bob Byrd called the president and said, you know, Mr. President, I'm not going to be able to support your budget if you include that provision. So the president called me, and suddenly I was $8 billion in the hole. And so I told the people at OMB, where can we go to come up with $8 billion? And we found, you know, some additional savings in different places. But I still got down to, I think it was about $3 to $4 billion. And finally I looked at my economist and I said, look at that growth number and figure out if maybe 0.5% on growth might be added, and that took care of the problem. So yeah, you're in a box, you turn to those gimmicks. The problem is it erodes the system, it erodes the honesty of the process. And you move, you know, sometimes you get to a date, and rather, you know, it's the end of September, and if you can move that payment to the 1st of October, you can save money in that year. It's phony, but it's the game that's played. So I think if you're serious, I would look at each of those gimmicks to try to make sure that they're not being used because it's dishonest. It's dishonest.
If I could just make a point on that, to backing up what Leon says about dishonesty. Jim Jones's portrait is hanging here on the wall. He's from the same state that you are and that I was born in, Okmulgee. And he had a big confrontation with President Reagan on the budget in '81. And when the time came, when the time was approaching to vote on the budget, at that point, Jim Jones thought he had it won because his budget resolution produced a smaller deficit than Ronald Reagan's. So what happened was that over a 10-day period, the Reagan administration simply decided that they were going to change some of their economic assumptions. And so then when we returned to town, lo and behold, all of a sudden, the low dollar man in terms of the deficit was Ronald Reagan, not Jim Jones. And that's why Jim Jones lost the vote that turned control of the floor and the Congress over to the minority. My point being, that's my basic objection to the Budget Act as it stands. It forces members of Congress to focus so much on details and gimmicks rather than determining what their basic values are and how they're going to deal with them. And sometimes we function a whole lot better on an informal basis than we do if we have to meet artificial targets that require us to do artificial things. And I'll just show you one thing. I've got an old chart which I held up on the House floor during that 1981 debate. And what it showed was the projection, the deficits under Graham-Rudman 1 from fiscal 85 to 90. The deficits were projected to go from 172 billion to zero in 1990. Instead, they went from 212 billion to $220 billion. Most of that was simply due to games that were played on economic estimates and assumptions.
Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both of you for sharing your experience and wisdom with us. Mr. Obie, I remember well during my first 2 terms here when you were chairman of Appropriations, and you were, during certain seasons, the most popular person in the House because everybody was trying to get their congressionally directed investments, also known as earmarks, approved. We haven't really had much discussion in this joint committee about earmarks. Would you both discuss what impact you think restoring earmarks might have in resolving some of the polarization, the conflicts that we have in the process now?
Well, I'm yes and no on it because I've been in the middle of that fight for so long. The problem is that Congress ought to have the right to determine where money goes on a district by district basis to at least some degree. They shouldn't be able to decide it all, but if I represented my district for 42 years, I think I had a hell of a lot better idea of what was needed for different communities than the OMB director did. The problem is that that's true for 90% of the members, but then you've always got 1 or 2% who foul the nest by getting greedy, by getting slippery, or sometimes even sleazy, and it gives the institution a bad name. So I guess what I would say is, in theory, I would like to see earmarks restored because that represents one manifestation of congressional power. But when I see what it does to the institution, it's very hard for me to recommend that they restore those. If you could find some way, the other problem you have is when you start to explode the number of earmarks. The Labor H bill went from 0 earmarks to over 4,000 earmarks within a 4 or 5 year period. That eats up an enormous amount of staff time just checking out the project to make sure that somebody isn't pulling a fast one. And so it's a prerogative that the Congress ought to have, but I would rather look elsewhere for preserving the Congress's constitutional authority.
I'm a supporter of allowing members to do this because I think members are elected to represent their constituents. And if there's a need that your constituency faces, you ought to be able to have the opportunity to go to the key chairman and members of a committee and justify providing funding for that particular effort. I think that part and parcel of your responsibility as a representative of the people. There are ways to try to check this. I think the reason earmarks became such a target is because they got out of control. Huge numbers were added to certain bills. I think it created real problems. Some of those earmarks were unjustified. That created real problems. But I think if you have a limited number and you have a greater transparency in what is included in earmarks so the public knows what's a part of it, I think there's a way to do this. And I have to tell you, from the approach of running this place, from the approach of being in the administration as chief of staff, trying to be able to get things done up here, the ability to be able to focus on what somebody needs is a very important incentive to trying to urge that individual to do the right vote. And I think having given that up has really hurt both the leadership and it's hurt the ability of administrations to be able to work their will on the Hill.
I appreciate
I agree
both
with
answers.
that too. But let me just point out, one of our problems is we know so many things that ain't so. And the number one project that got the Congress into trouble on earmarks was the Bridge to Nowhere. But guess what? Number one, that was not done by the Appropriations Committee. It was done by the Authorizing Committee. Number two, the money that went to that bridge came out of Alaska's share. It didn't come out of anybody else's. So the Congress took a real beating for stuff that wasn't so.
Thank you very much.
Senator Blunt.
I'm no expert on the Bridge to Nowhere, but I think number 3 is it actually went somewhere. And then, but under the circumstances you mentioned, there's not much good said about the Senate. The Senate is designed to be a disappointing institution, and we fulfill that. But I appreciate Co-Chairman Lowy's comments that we have tried this year. We got all our bills out of the committee by the end of June. moving those bills in packages. You know, we don't have a lot of history here in recent years. Somebody could walk off the field at any moment, but not allowing the appropriations process to become the authorizing process is important. There are times when authorizers and appropriators and everybody else agrees this is a moving vehicle, this is something that needs to be done, this is the moment to do it. And then the other comment that Congresswoman Loy made is she's leaving here to go to a conference committee. Now, this is a much more unique thing than it would have been a decade ago, the idea of going to a conference committee. And to go back to my other comment, anybody could walk off the field at any moment. And Congresswoman Loy said the committee meeting was just canceled. But we both voted to go to conference, and we're ready to go to conference. And maybe, you know, some experience. Part of the problem is we haven't had a real number since the Budget Control Act. And I think both of you have addressed that in different ways. You have to have some agreed to number to know how you're starting. So one reason this year might work better than last year is last year we weren't shooting with real bullets until about November, when there's an agreement, okay, here's the real number we're going to use. The whole process, the budget process, the spending process, the entire process is based on we know so much that isn't so, like Congressman Obey just said. We know this is not going to work out this way. Makes it really hard to get in and do the work that we need to do. A couple of thoughts. One, I don't think it's coincidental that the real breakdown in the process ended about the same time members didn't have anything to go home and specifically talk about. What about the idea that Senator Byrd objected to, that you could only appropriate things that were authorized with the transportation caveat, but would that be a way back to where members had more reasons to talk about what they had voted for than we currently give them?
I think it is important. I did it as OMB director. Frankly, I did it as chairman of the Budget Committee, was to really stress the importance of the authorizers to do their job in authorizing particular spending, rather than having the Appropriations Committee have to totally carry that ball and have to deal with unauthorized projects of one kind or another. You know, the problem I see now is, as I said, when I was here, every one of these committee rooms was working. There were subcommittees meeting, there were full committees meeting. You know, the committees I served on were having hearings. They were doing markup. They were in business. And frankly, the chairman of those committees and the ranking members would not have it any other way. The chairman of the authorizing committees said, you damn well are not going to move this through appropriations because it's my jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. That's the way it used to operate. And that has broken down. And I think it's made the problem that much worse.
I want to get to calendar year. One of your recommendations was we would have more time if we worked on the calendar year rather than the current fiscal year. I'd like both of you to comment on that. I know that's your recommendation. So, Congressman Obey, do you want to start would that make this process work any better than where we currently are?
I don't really care. What I care about is whether or not you can get your work done.
Right.
And I just think that if you eliminated the budget, the necessity to pass the budget resolution, if you went back to the old system of simply informal agreements between the leadership and the committees about how much ought to be spent in that area, you would have a lot more time to deal with appropriations. I think that would be a bigger change.
So you'd buy that extra 3 months by just eliminating the budget process and...
Yeah, and if you want to do the additional, or if you want to move the date as well, I don't care. I don't know if it would help or hurt, but I do know that right now, we're spending a hell of a lot of time on an institutional press release that doesn't spend a dime.
Secretary Panetta?
You know, I mean, I understand David's point, and frankly, at that time, Appropriations, Ways and Means, I think there was a process that they abided by. But the reality is that you are now operating in a situation where you're facing a $1 trillion deficits. You've got a $20 trillion debt that is going to explode in the out years. All of the projections say what's going to happen. And I don't think you can do this just simply by appropriations and Ways and Means because of the tough decisions that are going to be necessary in order to put this back on the right track. That's the problem. And there really is no, appropriations is not going to do that on their own. They don't deal with mandatory. And Ways and Means is not going to do what they have to do without some kind of mandate from the budget process in terms of reconciliation, the way it's supposed to work. So I think the reason you've got to put a better process in place in terms of the budget is to try to deal with the challenges we are facing as a country in terms of trying to ultimately put this country on a better fiscal track over the next 5 to 10 years. You're going to need that kind of budget. I know how appropriations operates on a year-to-year basis. I know how Ways and Means operates on a year-to-year basis. But the bottom line is you are not going to deal with the elements of the budget that have to be dealt with in order to improve our fiscal situation without having at least a committee that looks at the whole picture.
Senator Bennett.
I guess I'd like to start where you ended. First of all, I wonder whether either of you would be willing to run for Congress again, based on your testimony. And while you're considering your answer to that, let me ask this question. After 10 years of budget press releases and cliffs and wasting money for the Defense Department and shutting the government down and all in the name of fiscal responsibility, we find ourselves in a place where next year, I guess, we're going to collect about just under 17% of our GDP in revenue, and we're going to spend almost 21% of spending as a percentage of GDP. That will create the largest deficit that we've had as a percentage of GDP in the nation's history outside of a war or a recession. And Mr. Panetta, Secretary Panetta, you mentioned earlier that the way you see it, it's either management by crisis or by leadership. Leadership's better than crisis, but there's not a lot of leadership around here, and I'm really worried about a crisis. And I wonder whether you could both sort of help us understand what the conditions are, the political conditions, you're both politicians, what they need to be for us to actually address this issue, grapple with this issue in a meaningful and responsible way. What the process, Leon, looks like that you're talking about really. I mean, if you were here, what would it look like to drive a budget agreement that dealt not just with discretionary but mandatory spending as well? And then finally, if you could each just say a word about what it would mean for members to actually take back some responsibility from leadership. There are a lot of us that have worked here throughout a time when there's not been any opportunity for members to make decisions about the kinds of things you're talking about. So any perspective on any of that, I would appreciate.
Well, that's the issue that I really struggle with, which is how can this place get back to governing? And in many ways, that's the bottom line. You're elected to govern. You're not elected to come back here and pound your shoe on the table and simply play politics. You're elected to come back here to govern. And governing involves some tough decisions. And the issue is how can we get back to that? Because, I'm not so sure, frankly. When I was here, governing was good politics. It made sense for me to come back here and work, even if it was a Republican administration, or Republican president, or a Democratic president. If we governed and did what we thought was necessary, found the right consensus, found compromise, got things done, even though, my constituents might not always agree with my positions, they knew we were governing. We're running the country. I'm not so sure right now that governing is considered good politics, as opposed to stopping the other side from doing what they want to do. You guys are engaged in trench warfare up here. You're in your trenches, and you're fighting this war, and you're throwing grenades at one another, and every once in a while you come out of there. You're worried about somebody shooting you in the back if you try to negotiate something. And so, nobody wants to go into no man's land. So you stay in the trenches. How do you break that down? How do you get back to governing? That really requires tough leadership that is going to have to take risks. Look, when David and I were here, it was not only the leadership. I mean, look, Tip O'Neill and Bob Michael used to kick the hell out of us if we didn't get the budget resolution done. They backed us up on tough enforcement. They used to, Tip has said, used to constantly say, when are you getting the budget resolution done? We need it done. And they were pushing. They were pushing and backed it up. And so you need to have that leadership at all levels. We had chairmen, strong chairmen at the time. People like Rostenkowski and people like John Dingell. And let me tell you something, these were not chairmen who just kind of sat back and waited to see what the hell the budget was going to give them. They basically used to come to me and say, what the hell are you up to? What are you doing? And I had to visit every chairman. When I was budget chairman, I visited every chairman to try to make sure that they were informed of what was going to happen, because otherwise that chairman had the power to throw the whole damn thing off track. So because there was leadership at those key levels, and all of them wanted, they thought it was abhorrent if we didn't pass a budget resolution. Tip O'Neill, Tom Foley, everybody was on my butt in order to make sure we got it. That's what they cared about that. If that's not there, if that pressure is not there, if everybody sees, that you can take shortcuts in the process, it's not going to happen under any circumstance. The other thing, very frankly, is you need a president of the United States who cares about this stuff. If a president of the United States really cares about this stuff and is willing to convene bipartisan leadership to focus on the tough choices that need to be made and is there to back it up, let me tell you something. Then you'll see things happen. George Bush, George Bush made the pledge, read my lips, no new taxes. And I remember as budget chair, he asked me to come up and talk to him after he soon got elected. And I said, Mr. President, let me tell you something. You're not going to be able to stick by that because the deficits are going up. And you're going to have to confront that. And he said to me, frankly, look, I can't back away from that now, but there will be a point at which we'll have to sit down and negotiate and approach. And to his credit, and it was tough for him. I understand the politics of this stuff. It was tough. But he was willing to go ahead and negotiate. Republicans, Democrats, and that's what led us to the 90 budget agreement. It took courage, took courage. You know, he may well have paid a price for that. But, you know, you guys are elected to exercise leadership. I think unless you bring those ingredients to bear, members on their own are not going to touch this stuff because it is volatile. You're not going to deal with, entitlements. You're not going to deal with raising taxes. You're not going to deal with, all of the issues you got to deal with because it's trouble. You're going to, doing that on your own, it would be nuts. But if you knew you had the cover of leadership and you knew that there were people that were going to protect you in making these tough decisions, then there are members that are willing to walk that line. But if that's not there, this is tough to do.
Senator Ernst.
Let me, if I could just comment on something Leon said. My problem with all of this is that we're all talking about what we do on the process end in order to solve the political problem. The problem the country is facing is not process. It's political. It's political. It's political. And everything else is just avoidance. You can't deal with the real problem on this committee. Start with districting. I mean, if you have, I was elected for 42 years from a 52% Democratic district. That meant that I had plenty of incentives to try to find independent votes and some Republican votes on a good day. And that's what it took to get elected in a district like that. Today, we've got too damn many 72% districts rather than 52% districts. And as a result, there are no incentives to legislate. There are no incentives to compromise. You think Joe McDade could do today what he did with me when I got him to agree to a bipartisan 302B allocation out of appropriations? You think Joe McDade could do that today without having his head handed to him? Like hell. No way in God's green earth that he could do that. Do you think that I, proposing a joint 302B allocation back in those days in '94, do you think I could do that under this atmosphere today? I sincerely doubt it. So you've got the districting problem, and then you've got campaign finance. The major reason I retired, I love this place, but the major reason I retired is that I knew in a 52% district I was going to have to spend all of my time being a glorified telemarketer raising dollars. And that's the last damn thing in the world that I wanted to do when I came here. And so it's what the political system is doing to everything else. We're not attacking the Medicare. We're not attacking health care in a constructive way. We just, parties are looking for a way to one-up everybody else. And you've got to have some incentives built into the system, or it's just a bunch of high-minded talk that isn't going to get us anywhere. So you've got to look beyond the process issues. And then if you could somehow change the political atmosphere, process will take care of itself, because Archie the cockroach is right. What counts is not what system you have. What counts is what you do with whatever kind of system you happen to have.
Senator Ernst.
Wow, thank you to our witnesses today. It's been really good to hear from both of you, and I appreciate, Secretary, your words on leadership and courage and assuming that risk. And the issue that faces this committee, though, is what do you do in the absence of leadership? So we are tasked with coming up with a plan that will move our Congress forward. And so a number of different discussions have gone on here. You both have laid out different ideas on how we could reform the process, if the process is to be reformed. You, Mr. Obey, you mentioned the incentives. sometimes those motivating factors can be punitive as well. And one of the things that we have talked about as far as incentives for Congress to get their work done is to perhaps withhold members' pay, their recess, travel, until we get a budget in place. Because no matter what process we have in place, I don't care what it is, I'm going to tell you, and you know this, members of Congress are always going to find a way around that system. And we'll end up with CRs, we'll end up with other gimmicks. What do you think about those ideas? No budget, no pay, no budget, no recess. Could you both maybe talk a little bit about those ideas?
What do I think of those ideas? Not much.
Can you expound?
I don't really think I need to. I mean, what, if you're a freshman legislator in the House of Representatives, and you come in here, and the institution fails and doesn't produce a product, why should that individual member pay the price for the idiocy of the institution? I don't think they should.
Secretary.
You know, I know all the thoughts about trying to force what's, doing what's right. And, this is a cycle we always go through. I remember when I was on the Budget Committee that same kind of politics as now. Republicans didn't want to raise taxes. Democrats didn't want to cut entitlements or spending. And so if people weren't willing to confront those issues, then everybody was thinking of, what's the shortcut here? How can we do this, without having to really face those tough decisions? And so, people were coming up, obviously, with, a balanced budget amendment for the Constitution. I mean, Graham Rudman was basically the shortcut. I mean, Graham Rudman basically said, let's just set this path and cut the hell out of everything in order to stick to that path. Well, it's one way to do it, but the problem is the Congress never stuck to it. Mm-hmm. And so we always found a way around it. I think, frankly, the greater key is to, if you come to a decision on this joint committee to establish some changes or reforms, then I think it's absolutely essential for the leadership to require that you abide by those changes. And I think they're the ones that are going to have to push members to then take the steps necessary to get it done. That's the best way it works. Mm-hmm. Is to have them lean on the people that have to do the right job. Mm-hmm. And they have ways to basically be able to twist arms. They have to do it every day. And there has to be, I think, peer pressure that basically comes at play here so that everybody is pushing to adhere to it. I think if you establish penalties of one kind or another, the problem is that not only will members feel that that really is overstepping the line in terms of, of hurting them. But more importantly, what will happen is they will find other shortcuts to trying to get the job done, because then their pay or whatever will be on the line, so they'll find another shortcut. I think what you want to do is find a way to make sure they stick by the process.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just say, there's an assumption here, I think, that the leadership is always going to do well. Sometimes the leadership is incredibly ignorant on specific problems facing committees. I'll tell you one story. Bill Young, when Bill was chairman of the House Appropriations Committee and I was ranking member, Bill and I were very close. I really loved him. And he came up to me one day, he said, I just got to talk to somebody. You have no idea what just happened to me. I said, what's that? He said, I was in my office and Speaker Hastert, the phone rang and it was Speaker Hastert, and he said, Dave, Bill, he said, we got a rebellion on our hands and I need to talk to you about it quick. We need you to come right down here to my office. So Bill went down, he walked into the speaker's office, and the speaker said, "Bill, we've got a number of our junior members here, and they're upset with no progress, and they're demanding that we move appropriation bills. How soon can you start moving those damn appropriation bills?" And Bill looked at him and he said, "Well, Mr. Speaker, first I have to have an allocation." And the speaker said, "What's an allocation?" Now, don't assume that the way this place needs to work, political parties have a very legitimate role to play. But the kind of politics I was taught was that leaders of both parties would decide the direction they wanted to take their caucuses and their parties nationally. They would decide what direction they wanted to take, and they would put together their ideas on how to do it. Then you bring it into the Congress, and then what the committees are supposed to do is to leaven that product with the knowledge that individual committee members have picked up through years of working to understand this stuff. And I mean, there's an advantage if you've got somebody who's been on the labor age for 12 years and really knows how NIH works. And yet, committees are supposed to be able to know enough to persuade the leadership to modify their product so that it will stand the test of political reality when it hits the newspapers and when it hits the floor. And so you need a balance. You need a balance between strong leadership, also needs to be informed leadership, and then also a super informed committee members who know enough about these individual programs to know what is a good idea and what isn't, and how maybe you ought to modify the speaker's pet project in order to make it saleable. I am proud of the fact that in the years I was chairman, Nancy Pelosi never ordered me to do anything. If she wanted me to do something, she'd come in and she would be mighty persuasive. But in the end, if I said, "Nancy, I'm sorry, but here's why I can't do this," she would listen. She might not like it, and she might raise hell with me and ask me to change my mind, but she respected my knowledge, and I respected her obligations and her knowledge.
And I appreciate the input. If I could just wrap that up. I do believe that we will find a way around any process if there isn't something that's forcing us because of all the things that you outlined with partisanship and so forth. So I do support having measures in place to force us to do our jobs because unfortunately, with the dynamic we have right now, we are not doing our jobs and we don't have the leadership that compels us to do our jobs. Thank you.
I think
Thank you.
as long as you're thinking about that, I mean, I think rather than kind of, going after pay or what have you, I think trying to clearly set an approach that says legislation that does have a fiscal impact will go nowhere without a budget being approved. I think you need to turn to the process and what needs to be done. And then the price you pay is that you can't just simply find ways around it, avoiding the necessity for some kind of budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Kilmer.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks for being with us. Maybe, Mr. Panetta, I'll start with you. I'm struck that process changes and enforcement mechanisms only really work when they're implementing and enforcing policies for which there's a bipartisan political consensus. And when there's not that political consensus, they break down. So at one of our prior hearings, Maya McGinnis was here and talked about ways you could increase the transparency and awareness of some of the fiscal challenges that you've spoken so eloquently to. One of the suggestions that she spoke to was having some sort of a fiscal State of the Nation address where the GAO or the Comptroller General would come in and actually lay out some of our long-term fiscal challenges. I wanted to get your impression of that.
Well, you know, I think those are all good ideas. I think having some kind of summary as to, you know, or some kind of report or message with regards to our fiscal health is important, but frankly, that's the responsibility of the President of the United States. And we have not really, in recent years, had presidents address this country on the fiscal crisis that we're facing. Largely because presidents are like everybody else, that would interrupt their ability to get the money that they want to get for the spending that they want to do. And so, you know, there are very few presidents, in recent years who have really spoken clearly to the American people about the kind of crisis we're confronting. And I think the result is that everybody then thinks you can tiptoe past the graveyard. You know, nobody pays attention to the level of crisis that we're confronting. And one of the reasons we were able to pass the 90 budget agreement and the 93 budget agreement was because Ross Perot, in his campaign, made this an issue. You need to have, at a national level, somebody who's willing to address the crisis we're confronting.
Mr. Obie, I enjoyed reading your testimony, and the references to Archie the comic, Archie the Cockroach made me go on Amazon and buy Raising Hell for Justice. So I'd already read Worthy Fights, for what it's worth, Mr. Secretary. I wanted to echo the observations of Chairman Lowy. You know, you've seen this interesting dynamic this year where the Senate has committed to a bipartisan process, agree on 302Bs, you know, not having the partisan riders, a very different process in the House. I got an opportunity to think a lot about process reform during our 13th hour of markup last night. I'm struck that the Senate hasn't been more successful in finding success because of rules or process, but because they made a commitment to a bipartisan and consensus-built process. Now, having said that, in your testimony, you made reference to reconstituting the Budget Committee so that it more accurately reflects sort of the realities of what's coming out of Ways and Means and of what's coming out of Appropes. I was hoping you could just speak a bit more about why you think that would improve the budget process. This was for you, Mr. Obie.
Well, let me say, I think there's a very good reason why the Senate appears to be working in a more bipartisan way than the House is on this stuff. And it's called districting. It's the way the lines are drawn. If you're in the Senate, you represent the whole mixture of pressures and counter-pressures in the state. If you're in the House, and if your legislature has drafted it so that Democrats and Republicans are super saved, then they don't have any pressure to compromise. In fact, the pressure is just the opposite. If you pull a Joe McDade and try to work out a compromise with Dave Obie, you're going to get skinned by your hard right. And if you're Obie trying to work out a compromise with McDade, the same thing might happen. I mean, we can talk all we want about these little issues. They're all around the edge issues as far as I'm concerned. What counts in the end is what kind of incentives you have in the system besides human nature. What kind of systems you have built into the system to pressure people to do what's for the good of the order. And the only way you get that is to change redistricting. I think you also need to counterweight the incredible role of money in this place. And thirdly, you've got to have a party leadership who is going to pull the main single issue groups in your umbrella into your office and tell them to go to hell. That you're going to do what's right and you need their help to do what's right. And if they want to hit you with their priorities after A, B, and C are done, fine. But until then, to hell with you. I mean, until you get that kind of approach from our leaders, until they mean it, and until the involved citizens of this country decide that it's more important to get something done than to have me win all the time, we're just going to be going nowhere. This is a crisis. Yes, the debt and the deficit is a serious problem, but it's not the crisis that we have with the crisis of confidence in the political system right now. That's the real crisis. And I don't see much real work being done on that.
Thanks, Chairman. I yield back.
Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank both the co-chairs for these outstanding witnesses today, and I so respect their contributions, their careers, and I thank you both for being here today. It's been very fascinating. I've only been in the Senate 3 years. I'm on the Budget Committee. I come from a business world where this conversation is alien to me. I mean, we fund things, we do budgets like breathing. You have to. Biennial, I don't know any corporation to do biennial. I know a couple of states do. The last 3 years, we've been looking at best practices of other countries, states, and companies. I can't find anybody that has a budget resolution that's not a law, leads to an authorization that really hasn't been done in 2 decades, and then an appropriation process. I believe, frankly, after looking at this in depth, and I want to get your opinion on 2 questions very quickly, and I'll get to it very quickly. I think this whole process was doomed the day the '74 Budget Act was enacted. It's never worked. It can't work. It will never work. It's only funded the government on time 4 times in 44 years. And Secretary, I think 2 of those years were on your watch in the 90s. There were 2 years in the 70s, right after it was enacted. Other than that, we've always used continuing resolutions. As a matter of fact, we used 177 continuing resolutions in those 44 years. And actually, and we don't write about this much, but Congress has actually shut the government down 20 times during that period of time. Now, you talk about breeding confidence with the electorate, I'm sorry, but that just doesn't do it. So my question is twofold. I think there are 2 levels of issues here. One is, how do we fund the government on time without all this drama, without the use of CRs? That's the primary focus of this committee. But you both bring up the second dimension of this, and that is dealing with this debt crisis. I thank you so much for calling it a crisis, because sometimes up here, we just, kind of skip past the graveyard here on this thing. Let me just, how do you ever get at the spending issue if you don't really consider all of your expenses? And let me be a little more direct. I'd like Chairman, you and Secretary both address this, if you will. We spent $4.3 trillion this year in total expenses. About 1.3 of that is discretionary. The balance of that's mandatory. By definition, in the Senate, the Finance Committee is in charge of Social Security and Medicare, and so in theory, you think, well, okay, they're in charge of mandatory expenses, but they never really get looked at by the definition of mandatory. So the question is, how in the world should we be thinking about, I don't know any other budget process in the world that doesn't budget its full expenses. And it forces you then to look at the withholding equation on the revenue side, on Social Security, the same thing on the Medicare side. We're told the Medicare trust fund goes to 0 now in 8 years. I don't know any other better definition of a crisis than that. Help me understand how we are going to ever solve this if the budget authorization and funding process or appropriation process only deals with 25–30% of what we spend, and how would you recommend we think about that, Secretary?
Well, you can't do it. You can't do it. You're not going to solve the problem facing this country unless you deal with all aspects of the budget. That's the reality. And people have tried to avoid dealing with certain aspects of it. And so the result is that it distorts the process. I mean, The idea that you can, you increase defense, leave mandatories alone, and simply go at it through discretionary accounts, is, you're kidding yourself in terms of whether or not that's going to deal with the larger crisis that you're confronting. So it seems to me that if the budget process is going to count for anything, the only justification for the budget process is that it looks at that bigger picture. And that should be the responsibility of the budget committee, to look at that bigger picture and where we're headed, and then to deal with each of those elements. What are we doing on discretionary spending? What are we doing on defense spending? What are we doing on mandatory spending? I mean, I think mandatories, frankly, ought to be part of the budget process, and looking at the different mandatory programs, how they're being spent, how they're, what kind of trouble are they in, how effective are they? Because a lot of the stuff on autopilot has been going on for years without taking the time to really look at the elements of it. So that ought to be part of it. And very frankly, revenues have to be part of that as well. There's a revenue part of the budget that is extremely important to the entire picture. You got to look at all of that. And the only way you're going to be able to address the level of crisis that we're now confronting, and it is like a business. You can't run a business and not look at every aspect of your costs in that business. And if you do that, you can get the cost down. Tough decisions. You may have to fire people. You may have to do things that cost you money. They're tough decisions, but that's what running a business is all about. Well, the same thing's true here. You want to run the country, you're going to have to make some tough decisions on these issues. And it is the process of avoiding those tough decisions over these last 12 or 15 years that has gotten us into deeper trouble. It's easy to spend money in this place. It's easy to cut taxes in this place. But when you have to pay the piper, when you've got to say, what are we doing to the deficit? What are we doing to the taxpayers in this country? Then, people try to find a way around that responsibility, that accountability. And somehow, unless we get back to that larger process of looking at the larger picture, we're going to continue to try to find ways to get around the responsibilities that we have.
I guess what I would say is that we need to remember that there is no requirement in a democracy for a happy ending. There just isn't. And we aren't going to have a happy ending unless we recognize that some fundamental things have to change. And I go right back to redistricting. I think it's modestly possible for the Senate in the end to tackle these issues. I think it's highly unlikely that the House will be able to successfully attack these issues so long as you have the same people coming here time after time. I mean, you've got, it used to be fun to solve problems. I mean, when I chaired the Foreign Operations Subcommittee, and Nita was a member of the subcommittee then, when we went to conference, the Senate chair was Bob Caston from my own state. And before we sat down in conference, I sat down with my staff, and the very first question I always asked was, what does Bob have to have in the end in order to sign up? And we would work from that point. When I became chairman, I was naive enough to think, I've now got the gavel, I can do things my way. No way. I mean, I discovered that the job of a chairman is to find that point at which you get 218 votes. That's the job of a chairman. And then secondarily, if he can also in the process push his values and his favored programs, that's a bonus. But first you got to get things done. And so until we change the basics, I don't see how we get there. I wish I did. I know that, political consultants will say, never leave them with a downer. I'm sorry. I see the downers right now, and I wish I didn't.
Thank you.
Representative Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all both for being here. I was a young staffer during both of your tenures here. I remember just as much color from you, Chairman Obie, on the floor then as you're giving us today. I thank you for that. I stare at your picture, Mr. Secretary, day in and day out on this committee. I appreciate in your opening that you said that we actually have a responsibility as a joint committee, not just an opportunity. I've always thought of it as an opportunity, but the truth is we do have a responsibility to get something done. Biggest disappointment of my short congressional career was the super committee that had an opportunity to look at every single dollar of government spending, take it directly to the floor to avoid the politics that you all have both talked about, and they couldn't find a single dollar on which they agreed. I wanted to focus on that just for a moment, coming from a regular order appropriations process, coming from both an Article 1 and an Article 2 spot as you do, Mr. Secretary. What do you think about that super committee process where you say we are going to try to bring together some thought leaders and we are going to bypass the regular committee process and send some tough decisions directly to the floor if the authorizers are failing to handle it on their own?
Look, I always thought as a budget chairman that it was our responsibility to make those tough decisions. And fortunate thing is at the time, I had the broad support of leadership, the president, and others to be able to take those steps. I also understand that may be impossible right now, particularly as far as the House is concerned. I don't think it's impossible in terms of the Senate, but I think it's impossible in terms of the House. And for that reason, I was concerned that when Simpson-Bowles made their recommendations, the President asked me about that, and I said, you ought to endorse what Simpson-Bowles did, because very frankly, it is bipartisan, tough decisions were made. I think, you might not agree with all the recommendations in it, but I think it's important to endorse the process. And he was concerned about some of the particular recommendations, so I understand that. But I think you may have reached the point where you may need to have a Simpson-Bowles type commission. Be able to make recommendations that deal with each of the areas I just talked about. Because I don't see that happening otherwise. And very frankly, unless you have those decisions in place, I'm not sure that process alone is going to get you there.
I look around at particularly the newer members who are here. They came because of the sense of urgency that you all both describe, and I see lots of members that would be pleased to cast that deciding vote. If all they had to trade for the future security of the country was the job that they have today, they'd happily trade it away. I've always said the happiest folks on Capitol Hill were the Democrats who lost their job over the Affordable Care Act. What a small price to pay for doing something that you thought was going to move the country in the right direction. But thinking about doing big things, 1983, Social Security amendments, no one was poor-mouthing those changes. Raised taxes, reduced benefits, raised ages, did all the tough things, but everybody was on board collectively, and so we all were touting our successes as a body and as a nation instead of bad-mouthing them. You mentioned, Mr. Secretary, what Ross Perot did to allow the 93 Reconciliation Act, but as I remember that act, there was not one Republican vote for that on the House side. It was strictly a partisan bill. I go back and look at the budgets that you were able to move through the House. Time and time again, not a single Republican vote on the floor of the House. We sometimes talk about the good old days as if they were really pretty good. And the fact is this partisanship has been going on a long time. I value the three-step process, a budget where people can stake out a political vision, an authorizing process where perhaps I'm going to overpromise because I don't actually have to come up with the dollars, and an appropriations process that now the rubber meets the road. It lets some political steam off the pot. In the name of process reform, we have talked about reducing those steps. Chairman Obie recommended abolishing the Budget Committee in his opening comments. Tell me about how that the potential for letting steam off the pot in a three-step process versus the burning of time that could be used more productively elsewhere.
Well, I don't see much to recommend the existing system. I mean, the problem you have, just look at Hal Rogers' problem when he took over from me as chairman of the committee. And take a look at the transportation bill, which he tried to bring to the floor. I mean, that transportation bill contained the reductions that were necessary in order to meet the targets of the budget resolution, or the assumptions of the budget resolution. And what happened to him? He got chewed up alive. I mean, because, in my view, the Budget Committee overreached. It's easy to do that if you come up with a bright idea. It's easy if somebody else has to implement it, because you can always squawk about the imperfections of the latter guy's style that were to blame. That's not what the problem is. In my view, the Budget Committee in recent years has overreached. It's because they thought it was more possible, or it was possible to do more than in fact was possible. I don't like super committees, because the whole idea of committees in the first place is to take the people who know the most about a subject and put them to work on it. And usually with super committees, you've got people who, as I said earlier, they can fly at 30,000 feet, but they don't have to then explain to Granny in the nursing home why you're going to have your benefits shaved back this year. So to me, what's most important first is to understand we need a sense of balance. Yes, we have a budget deficit, and that is a serious problem. We also have an infrastructure deficit. We also have an education deficit. If you want to talk about education, I mean, with the problem with the Bowles committee is that expectations around here before it was established, people would say, oh, domestic discretionary, they're not the problem, they've already been cut. And then each time recommendations came up, they cut further in domestic discretionary. I just don't trust wise ones at the top who don't have to implement whatever reductions you're talking about. To me, I don't like the product that the Ways and Means Committee produced in this Congress, but at least they had a level of knowledge about it that is higher than a lot of people who would have been likely to be appointed to any commission to look at the same problems.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask, I know Mr. Obie is speaking with the heart as an Article 1 servant. Could I just ask the Secretary whether or not he's given us advice today as on behalf of Article 2 or on behalf of Article 1? Where does your heart sit, Mr. Secretary, having served at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue?
You know, my view is that Article 1 and Article 2 both have to work together in order to govern the country. And if the President of the United States thinks that he's going to be able to get this done without a partnership with the Congress and the ability to get it done, then he's wrong. It ain't going to happen. And if Congress thinks that somehow they can make this process work without the executive branch and working with them, I think that's also a mistake. I think what's missing in particular with these last few years. I mean, look, with Republican administrations that I worked with at the time that I was here, we had a very strong working relationship. I worked very closely with Dick Darman when he was O&B director. I worked very closely with Jim Baker when he was operating out of the White House. And they would come up and we'd sit down and we'd work through these issues. And, you know, the ability to have that kind of partnership, the ability to have that kind of consultation is what makes our democracy run. And the inability to have that when you try to basically force your way through in a particular way, that's what undermines, I think, the effectiveness of our democracy. So, you know, you can make this process work if there's trust. I mean, the biggest problem right now is there's a lack of trust between the branches and between members and between the people and this institution. There's a lack of trust. And very frankly, if you don't have trust in our democracy, it's not going to work. And somehow we've got to find a way to restore that trust. And the way you do that is by talking to one another, talking with people in authority, respecting who they are, listening to them, and then trying to figure out a way for both of you to be able to get it done. That's the way our forefathers designed it, and that's the way it's supposed to be.
Mr. Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairwoman. I agree with Senator Perdue. Our panelists have been outstanding, and the thought that recurs to me is, with the wisdom and intellect and experience of all the folks that we've had come before this committee, if we can't, at a minimum, improve the process, we're in deeper trouble than I even thought as a new member. And by the way, Mr. Secretary, I really thoroughly enjoy working with your son, Jimmy. He's one of those American first guys. He's a dad first. He's a Panetta first, way before you get to being a Democrat. And I got to say, as a new member, I'm encouraged with my cohorts who came to not just move the deck chairs around, but to fundamentally change the game up here for the American people. And so with that, it seems to me that whether you're trying to do what Senator Perdue articulated as our sort of first goal and get predictability and certainty in getting a budget out and funding the government, or you're trying to have budget outcomes that somehow improve the position fiscally of this country and chip away at the deficit and debt. Either way, you have to acknowledge, as Chairman Obie mentioned earlier, that we don't have the political will collectively. I'd like to think I do. I think everybody would like to raise their hand and say, well, I do. But collectively, we know that we don't. Republicans don't. Democrats don't. So can we just start with that assumption that we don't have the political will? And then I think and only then can you really get at solving both the process issue and the outcome issue. At least you have an opportunity to. Now, I think you first have to acknowledge, and I agree with Chairman Obie, there are structural issues with campaign finance, gerrymandering. I hate it. We can all kick around ideas of how to change that. I'd actually say, because we haven't fixed gerrymandering, I'm a term limit guy as well. There are lots of structural reforms to consider that I think would improve the behavior. I think most states, like the great state of Texas, work on a balanced budget because they have a forcing mechanism, the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. Now, absent that, we have to come up with what Senator Ernst suggested in her discussion with you, and that is a forcing mechanism. It's the only way to do it. Let's just acknowledge the nature of the beast is what it is. I'm trying to figure out how you can't be so squirrely in the process that whatever enforcement mechanism you put in place, that you don't have some rule in the 11th hour where everybody can vote on it and nobody's accountable for it, and the American people don't understand what happens, and we just keep on going down that path of destruction, sleepwalking, as they say, off this cliff. I go back to her question, and you said something, and I'm hopeful because you had at least something resonated with you in the way of an enforcement. No budget, no pay. No budget, no recess. I don't know if those will work. I'm willing to try all of them, but no budget, no spend. No budget, no pass, no legislation, no spend that has a fiscal impact. So you think that that might work. So we've got an issue, an item on the table for consideration. Would you expound on that?
Well, the way it operated was that, in order for the authorizing committees to move spending legislation, in order for appropriations to move their bills, there had to be a budget. And what happened was, as the Budget Committee failed to pass budget resolutions, then they came up with this trigger mechanism to basically assign levels to the Appropriations Committee to operate without a budget, and that bypassed the process. I think it's important to stick to the basic discipline of the process, which is pass a budget and pass it by a certain date. And if it doesn't pass, you're not going to move any legislation that has some kind of fiscal impact. And frankly, appropriations committees ought not to move forward. Now, I understand the politics. If you're suddenly stuck and you can't do anything, then you find waivers, you find ways around it. I mean, that's the way we govern. But, it really does require some degree of discipline if you're going to establish any process. You've got to have the ability to try to stick to that discipline. And, look, the biggest problem here is none of these decisions that we are talking about are easy. I mean, and there isn't a process way to make them easy. They're very tough decisions. And the problem right now is I think most people in this institution would like to be able to somehow move the process without pissing off people. Doesn't work that way. You're going to have to offend people. With the decisions in the budget, with the decisions on discipline, you're going to have to do that. People don't like to take political risks. But I have never seen a leader in this institution, or frankly in the presidency, I have never seen a leader who has been able to lead and not take risks. And that's what you're going to have to, that's probably the first principle that's going to have to apply here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Thank you, Secretary Panetta, Chairman Obie, for appearing before us today. I want to advise members that they can submit written questions to be answered later in writing. They'll be made part of the formal hearing. Any members wishing to submit questions or extraneous material may do so within 7 days. Now, this concludes our 5th public hearing and fulfills the Bipartisan Budget Act statutory requirement for the Select Committee to conduct at least 5 such hearings by November 30th. While our requirement has been fulfilled, I believe there's value in exploring topics for additional hearings in the future. Looking back, I believe our hearings have been insightful. With each discussion, I've been encouraged by the involvement and participation of our members and impressed by and grateful for the advice and testimony brought by the many outside witnesses, including the 25 of our colleagues who participated in Members' Day. I'm happy to report that bipartisan, bicameral consensus is steadily growing with our group of 16. In fact, a number of our members have already submitted their reform ideas for improving the budget and appropriations process, and I'm encouraging all members to submit any ideas in writing to the co-chairs. While the statutory deadline for reporting our recommendations is the 30th of November, I've said from the beginning that the work drafting a proposal should begin sooner rather than later, and that time is now. With that said, starting this month, the co-chair and I will begin working informal working sessions. All members are welcome, encouraged to attend. I'm hopeful all members will. The mission of this panel is too important not to succeed, and your ideas and feedback garnered through our months of collective work are essential to that goal. So our staffs will be in touch regarding the pending schedule of these informal meetings. Once again, to our witnesses this morning, Secretary Panetta, Chairman Obie, thank you so much for your insightful testimony here today. And with that, this hearing stands adjourned.
thank you.